The ambulances idled beyond the floodlit fence line, engines ticking like impatient clocks. Snow drove sideways across the yard and erased tracks as fast as tires made them. The drivers kept their hands on the wheel and their eyes on the dispatch hut, waiting for an order to send them into the dark hills or hold them in place. Each minute without a clean instruction turned fuel into exhaust and turned wounded time into danger. In late December 1944, the Ardennes campaign strained the American rear as hard as the front. Cold, hardened mud into ridges that tossed vehicles offline, sealed drainage into ice, and drained field telephones and short-range radios of steady power. A temporary prisoner transit stockade sat inside that weather, a fenced grid of barracks and guard posts that processed German captives deeper into Allied custody. It also sat close enough to evacuation routes that ambulances and litter trucks passed through its orbit whenever the roads held. The duty officer on the midnight watch carried two ledgers that could not be separated. One tracked prisoners by count, movement, and escort, the paper spine of a system meant to prevent escapes and prevent abuse. The other tracked medical requests by time, location, and destination, the paper spine of a system meant to prevent needless loss. The storm fractured the link between those systems and the road. Messages arrived in pieces, confirmations arrived late, and a single request sometimes reappeared under a different timestamp as if it belonged to a different world. He treated the situation as a defect that demanded traceable correction. The communications sergeant ran checks without shortcuts. Handsets were tested, connectors scraped clean of ice, and spare batteries kept near the stove to slow their drain. The radio set was keyed in scheduled bursts to conserve power, and every transmission was copied into the log as it went out. None of it restored normal signal strength. It restored a discipline of method, a way to separate what was known from what had become noise. Inside the hut, the officer forced the storm into the logbook. Each incoming fragment received a timestamp and a named source. Each correction received initials, and each destination line stayed blank until a second confirmation matched the last reliable map reference. The translator wrote German names and medical terms in clear block letters, then read them back so two men heard the same words. The medical orderly recorded injury categories with the calm of intake, even as frost filmed the inside of the window. Outside, the yard tried to obey the paper. Ambulance crews walked between their vehicles and the hut, checking stretchers under tarps and brushing snow from headlights. A truck rolled in with a man on a litter, the driver having pushed through a frozen grade and refusing to leave him at the gate. The medics wanted a destination and received a hold instruction instead, not from indecision, but from refusal to launch a run on contradiction. The officer cleared space under the awning, moved the litter out of the wind, and kept the dispatch line clean. The military police sergeant wanted room to improvise. The stockade was full, prisoners restless, and the storm magnified every small delay into anger. The sergeant pushed for harsher control and for cutting routine to free guards for the gate. The officer denied it. The prisoner count stayed on schedule. Escorts stayed paired. Searches stayed documented. Food and latrine movements stayed supervised. He did not relax the rule set to buy speed, because speed built on disorder produced mistakes that multiplied across the yard and down the road. That denial carried cost. When a rear area tightened, men looked for someone to blame, and prisoners were the nearest target. The officer watched his own guards for slipping hands and raised voices, then corrected them in front of the fence line so the correction became part of routine. He demanded that orders be given cleanly and that compliance be enforced without humiliation. The same restraint that kept the dispatch log credible also kept the stockade from turning into a punishment yard. Hans Köhler watched from behind the inner wire and measured the Americans the way he had once measured signal strength. He had been a signalsman before capture, trained to respect the difference between a clear report and a corrupted one. In the barracks, corrupted information moved faster than any message line. A hard-faced prisoner with influence told the others the Americans were losing control and planned collective punishment to restore it. A sick man nearby coughed into his sleeve and stared at the ceiling boards as if he was already counting consequences. Hans kept his face blank and his hands still. In captivity, a single useful act became a label, and a label became danger. The strong prisoners enforced that danger by watching the weak and by watching anyone tempted to trade skill for favor. Hans did not deny his skills. He hid them behind silence and routine. He listened instead to the rhythm outside the fence, the measured steps of the count, the steady pattern of escorts, the absence of shouting. He saw the medical orderly pass an extra blanket through the wire to the sick man and saw an MP record the transfer on a clipboard. Near midnight, a radio call broke through in torn phrases. A location, urgency, more than one vehicle. The sergeant tried the frequency again and got only hiss. A runner was sent toward a road junction that served as a message point when wires failed. The officer did not turn fragments into immediate action. He turned them into questions and wrote those questions on the page, leaving the dispatch line incomplete until the runner returned or the caller came back on air. The ambulances continued to idle, engines burning steadily, men inside them staring at the same door. Hans understood the shape of the night. The Americans were trapped between two failures, one medical and one custodial, and they refused the shortcut that converted administrative stress into cruelty. The officer built a narrow channel through chaos by insisting on a single truth that could be signed for, even when that insistence cost time and earned resentment. In the barracks, the hard-faced prisoner repeated his warning and watched for movement. Hans stayed seated on his bunk, eyes open, keeping his breathing even, while the storm kept testing every rule from the outside. The runner returned with ice on his eyebrows and a damp notebook held under his coat. He brought a second set of coordinates and a time that did not match the first call. The duty officer laid the notebook beside his own log and forced both into the same grid. The communications sergeant keyed the radio again at the scheduled mark and received a burst of static that carried one clear syllable and then nothing. The officer chose the first corrective move that preserved accountability. He ordered a single ambulance dispatched on the only route that remained open to the nearest junction, not to chase guesswork, but to establish what the road allowed and to bring back a confirmed message if the phone point still stood. He wrote the vehicle number, the driver, the departure time, and the intended turnoffs, then had the medical orderly initial the entry. The military police sergeant logged the gate opening and assigned a control detail to track return. The driver pulled out slowly, chains clacking, headlights swallowed by snow. The remaining ambulances stayed in line, engines idling, their crews watching the taillights until the storm erased them. In the hut, the translator rewrote the request in standardized form, reduced to facts that could survive bad sound. He read the location letters back, and the communications sergeant compared them against a road map creased thin from constant use. Inside the stockade, the hard-faced prisoner took the delay as proof. He walked the barracks aisle and watched for men who looked toward the fence. He made sure others heard the consequences of being singled out. The sick man on the nearby bunk shivered despite the blanket and kept his eyes fixed on the boards above him. Hans kept his posture neutral. His training had taught him that a signal chain failed in predictable ways. Power loss, water intrusion, bad connectors. This chain was failing in human ways as well. Men repeated fragments because repetition felt like action. They guessed because guessing shortened the wait. Hans watched the American guards move in pairs and mark their checks on paper even as the snow buried the footprints that proved they had done it. After another scheduled radio burst, the communications sergeant asked the duty officer to authorize a faster standard, fewer timestamps, more reliance on the last known direction. The officer answered with procedure instead of argument. Every outgoing instruction required a named source, a time, and a second confirmation, even if the confirmation came from a man with frozen eyelashes and a notebook under his coat. The dispatched ambulance returned after an hour, with its windshield rimmed in ice and its driver angry at the waste. The junction had been abandoned. The field phone pole stood, but the handset was gone, and the snow had swallowed the tracks of the last messenger. The driver brought back one reliable detail. A stretch of road had drifted shut beyond the next bend, forcing any run to detour along a narrower lane that slowed everything and could trap a vehicle if it slid. The duty officer logged that detail as a constraint and recalculated the dispatch grid. The medical orderly adjusted the priority list to reflect travel time. The communications sergeant switched frequencies and tried to reach a relay point farther west, then farther south, then returned to the original channel because abandoning it meant losing the one thread that still carried a voice at intervals. Each attempt produced a new fragment. None produced closure. Close to 2 in the morning, the radio delivered a full sentence of meaning, but it arrived with a flaw that threatened to ruin it. The caller used a place name that the translator wrote and then underlined. 2 hamlets in the area carried near identical spellings, and the difference lived in a single vowel. The map held both. One route ran through the drifted grade the driver had marked impassable. The other ran past a bend where vehicles had begun to pile up in the dark. The communications sergeant wanted to choose the closer option and move. The medical orderly wanted any movement because the priority list had begun to carry waiting times that read like indictments. The military police sergeant wanted the gate to stop serving as a parking lot for worried drivers. The duty officer forced a stop. He marked the ambiguity as a red entry and refused to assign an ambulance to a word that could send it into the wrong ditch. He sent the runner back out with a written query folded tight and sealed in a rubberized pouch. A messenger route was slower than radio, but it carried clarity when the receiver could not. The runner left under MP control, signed out, and signed in on the same ledger that tracked prisoners and supplies, so that no gap in custody became a gap in truth. The storm punished that discipline. The runner did not return quickly. The radio offered more static than a repeat of the same ambiguous place name, then silence. Another casualty arrived on a litter from a stalled truck, and the duty officer shifted a blanket over the man's boots before he shifted ink on the page. He refused to let urgency turn into improvisation, because improvisation without a verified location turned into wasted miles. Inside the fence, the hard-faced prisoner watched the ambulances idle and told the others the Americans were losing control. He spoke in the language of certainty and punishment. A few men watched Hans because Hans watched the dispatch hut more than most. Hans kept his gaze level and his hands visible, practicing the same restraint he saw enforced outside. Near 3, the runner returned at last, boots packed with snow. The written reply carried the distinguishing detail the radio had failed to deliver: a river crossing, a mill building, a recognizable bend in the road. The translator rewrote the location in the log with the certainty of a corrected map reference. The duty officer signed the correction, then signed the dispatch line that followed, binding the next ambulance movement to a record that could be reviewed by daylight. The vehicle rolled out into the storm, and the yard returned to waiting. The duty officer watched the remaining lines on his priority list and accepted what the night had demonstrated. Procedure alone did not restore the link. It only kept failure from spreading into cruelty, and kept a broken signal from becoming a broken discipline. The next step demanded a new support, one that did not come from loosening rules, but from tightening them around a variable the system had not yet used. Dawn came as a thinning of black into charcoal. The wind shifted enough to stack snow in ridges that stayed put long enough to read. The dispatch hut remained bright under a bare bulb, its walls damp from heat that never reached the corners. The duty officer wrote with his gloves on, because bare skin froze to metal and paper alike. The ambulance sent on the corrected route returned with its chains glazed and its crew's faces raw. The patient made it back alive, and that steadied men who needed proof that the rear still worked. The duty officer read the timestamps and saw how close the run had come to waste. A stalled convoy at a narrow bend. A detour forced onto a smaller lane, minutes spent clearing room to pass. The margin between a successful evacuation and an empty drive had narrowed to a strip weather could erase. He chose a second attempt at control that tightened procedure instead of relaxing it. The communications sergeant shortened radio bursts and made them more frequent, logging every attempt whether it succeeded or failed. The translator posted a phonetic table and a grid key on the wall, and every location was forced into the same format: map reference, nearest landmark, road condition, and a repeat of the reference in letters. The medical orderly matched each request to a timestamp and a priority mark, so the same report could not multiply into contradictions. For a short stretch the method produced speed. A call came in clean enough to hold through a repeat. The translator captured the grid, the communications sergeant confirmed the frequency, and the duty officer dispatched a vehicle with a line that carried initials and departure time. Headlights cut into the snowfall and vanished toward the dark hills. 10 minutes later, another call arrived, and the grid did not exist on the map. The voice on the air repeated the same numbers with the confidence of a man who needed the line to be true. The duty officer marked the entry unverified and left the dispatch space blank. Outside, ambulance crews stepped out to stamp warmth into their feet, then looked back at the hut as if the paper itself had chosen delay. Inside, the medical priority list grew longer in tight handwriting. Frostbite from rear area exposure, a casualty shifted back when the forward aid point ran out of room, a man whose bandage had stiffened. Each new name made the room feel smaller. The MP sergeant pressed for wider latitude in dispatch and a sharper hand at the stockade, as if force at the fence could substitute for clarity on the road. Rumour grew in the barracks the way frost grew on glass. A hard-faced prisoner with influence walked the aisle and spoke in a low tone that carried farther than any shouted order. He framed the idling ambulances as proof that the Americans were losing control and would soon demand a scapegoat. He reminded men that skill became currency in captivity, and currency attracted collectors and thieves. He watched for anyone who looked toward the dispatch hut too often. He did not name Hans Köhler, but his gaze passed over Hans and returned. Hans kept his hands visible and his face blank. He had learned as a signalsman that corrupted transmissions invited imaginative reconstruction, and he had learned as a prisoner that imagination became an accusation. He listened instead to the Americans' routines, the count conducted on time, escorts moving in pairs, searches recorded, orders delivered without shouting. He watched a guard pass a bucket of warm water toward the infirmary door and then record the transfer in a log. The system did not stop the storm, but it stopped the yard from breaking into rage. The storm pressed another cost into the stockade. A sick prisoner in Hans's barracks stopped coughing and began breathing in small, careful pulls. When the count came, he tried to stand and failed. An MP at the doorway signaled for the medical orderly. The orderly entered with the translator and a guard, checked pulse and temperature, and wrote a short note that turned the condition into a requirement. A prisoner moved to the infirmary still remained a prisoner, and the MP sergeant pressed for extra restraints and harsher handling. The duty officer rejected the escalation. He ordered the standard escort pair, the standard search, and the standard movement entry with timestamps, then required the escort to walk at a pace that kept the litter level. The sick man was carried out under the same procedural care used on the wounded Americans under the awning, and the transfer went into the book without comment. Fatigue cracked through discipline in smaller ways that still mattered. A young guard, sleepless and raw, shoved a prisoner who hesitated at the latrine line. The shove was brief, but it revealed what strain wanted to become. The duty officer crossed the yard through the snow and corrected the guard in full view of the other MPs, then recorded the incident with a name and a time. The guard stiffened, returned to position, and did not shove again. Hans stored the correction as evidence of a system that bound power with record. Near mid-morning, the radio delivered a different kind of failure, one that procedure alone could not close. A call came in with a landmark name in German, a regional word that did not match the American grid. The translator recognized the language but could not anchor it to a coordinate without inventing one. The communications sergeant forced a repeat in phonetic letters and received only static. A search run in that weather risked becoming another casualty, and a wrong run risked burning hours the priority list did not have. The duty officer wrote a new constraint on the margin of the log. They required a bilingual anchor that could convert names into coordinates without turning translation into guesswork. He did not speak the obvious solution because saying it would make it real. Across the yard, Hans heard the fractured German syllables through the wall when the wind shifted, and he recognized the caller's insistence under distortion. He remained seated on his bunk and began outlining in silence the strict boundary of an offer that could be supervised, recorded, and denied any reward. The radio delivered another broken report, not a grid reference but a German landmark name scraped thin by static. The translator caught the consonants and lost the vowels. The communications sergeant hesitated over the map because two names in that region could sound the same when a man spoke through cold and panic. Outside, the ambulances waited in a line of dim headlights while wounded time accumulated somewhere beyond the drifted roads. The duty officer refused the shortcut that turned doubt into movement. He ordered the priority list kept visible, so every choice carried a recorded consequence. He ordered the MP sergeant to keep escorts paired and movements logged. He ordered the communications sergeant to transmit one standardized query in short bursts. Repeat the location in letters and add one fixed landmark. The set answered with hiss and a partial repetition that solved nothing. Inside the stockade, Hans Kohler heard the battered German syllables when the wind shifted. He recognized the cadence of a caller who had tried twice already and could not afford a third failure. He also recognized what stepping forward did to a prisoner. Skill became a label, and a label became a weapon inside the wire. He waited for an authorized movement interval, then walked to the inner fence at a normal pace. An MP shadowed him as required. The translator stood near the dispatch hut with his clipboard, trying to force a place name into an American grid. Hans stopped at the wire, kept his hands visible, and spoke to the translator in a low voice. The MP did not open a gate. He signaled the duty officer because nothing in that yard happened without a name attached to it. The duty officer stepped out into the snow, followed by the communications sergeant and the MP sergeant. No one asked for motives. Motives did not stabilize radios. The duty officer asked for a proposal that could be supervised and recorded. Hans offered only what his training supported and what captivity allowed. He could convert German landmark names into the American grid, identify common confusions in spelling and pronunciation, and give one verification question per uncertain point. He asked for no blanket, no ration, no reduction in count. He asked to do the work under constant guard, with the translator writing every word into the log. The communications sergeant objected in the language of control. Any enemy signals man carried habits that invited exploitation. The MP sergeant objected in the language of custody. A prisoner near the dispatch process created motion, and motion created gaps. The duty officer accepted the objections and designed around them. Hans would remain outside the hut. He would not touch radios, wires, or equipment. He would not handle the map. The translator would hold the map, read each uncertain name aloud, and record Hans's conversions in the official log. One MP would stand within arm's reach, and another at the door. The duty officer would initial every entry and sign the dispatch lines that followed. The yard held still as the conditions were stated. Hans nodded once, accepting constraint as the price of being heard. The translator read the garbled name again, first in German, then in phonetic letters. Hans corrected one sound and supplied a full place name with an alternate spelling that a tired mouth flattened. He added a fixed landmark, a mill by a bridge, and specified the bridge as stone, not timber. The translator wrote it, then found two candidate crossings on the map. Hans indicated the second option with a tilt of his chin. He offered one verification question. Ask whether the approach climbed past a chapel before bending left along a tree line. The communications sergeant transmitted the question. The reply came back in a short, clean sequence of letters and a confirmation of the chapel. The duty officer watched the ambiguity collapse into a single line. He dispatched one ambulance on the corrected route and logged the departure. The medical orderly adjusted the priority list. The MP sergeant logged the gate opening and assigned return control. Hans remained at the wire, supervised and silent, while headlights vanished into white. A second call followed fast, this one using a German road name the translator could not anchor. Hans tied it to the nearest American road number by association with a market town, then demanded a cross-check because the town name existed twice in the area. The duty officer sent a runner with a written query to a junction point. The runner signed out, left under escort, and returned with a confirmation that locked the second line in place without guesswork. An army is hardest to beat when its people keep the same equal rules in a crisis, turning freedom into a discipline rather than a slogan. The duty officer felt the sentence as accounting, not triumph. He had used an enemy prisoner as a narrow variable and refused to grant him power. He had kept custody procedures in force while the medical chain strained, and he had kept his own men under the same restraint he demanded at the fence. The log showed the work as supervised, limited, and signed for. The first ambulance returned with a survivor and a confirmation of the bridge and chapel. The second returned later on the verified route, not on the drifted grade that had trapped vehicles through the night. The correction did not look like heroism. It looked like routine preserved under abnormal conditions. Hans was sent back to the barracks as soon as the backlog thinned. The duty officer ended the exchange when necessity ended. Hans received no extra ration and no alteration in count. The translator closed the log and filed the pages. The MP sergeant searched Hans under standard procedure, recorded the movement, and returned him to the inner wire without comment. Inside, the hard-faced prisoner read the change before anyone spoke. He moved men away from Hans's bunk and let the space around it widen. He framed Hans's supervised work as betrayal, not because it had earned Hans comfort, but because it had earned him visibility. The sick man in the barracks breathed more evenly after hours by the infirmary stove, and that ordinary sound became the only reward Hans could name. Hans sat on his bunk with his hands on his knees and did not argue. He had stepped into responsibility and received the payment that came with it. Colder eyes, fewer words, a narrower circle. Outside, the duty officer added a final entry. Prisoner assisted under supervision, custody rules unchanged, no special treatment authorized. He initialed it, then signed his name beneath, making clear the decision belonged to his office and his accountability. The storm loosened its grip by degrees, not with the clean break, but with small concessions. Wind eased first, then visibility widened enough for drivers to see the next curve before they entered it. Plows cut single-lane corridors through drifts, leaving walls of packed snow that narrowed traffic and demanded slower speeds. The dispatch hut stayed busy, but the sound inside shifted from constant urgency to the clipped rhythm of routine. The duty officer kept the same rule set in place after the crisis peak passed. He did not treat the night as an exception that justified shortcuts in the morning. Every movement remained logged, every correction initialed, every departure tied to a named source. The communications sergeant continued scheduled radio checks even as signals steadied, building continuity across the break, so later review would show when the line returned to normal. The translator kept the phonetic grid posted and forced every location into the same format: map reference, fixed landmark, road condition, and a repeat of the reference in letters. Ambulances no longer idled for hours at the fence. They came in, received a clear destination, and rolled out at intervals that matched fuel, daylight, and the narrow road corridors. The medical orderly reduced the backlog by turning emergencies into orderly queues, then returned to steady triage that matched capacity to need. Chains were inspected, stretchers wiped dry, and drivers warmed their hands over engine blocks before taking the road. When a vehicle returned late, the delay was written down as a constraint, not explained away as weather. Hans Kohler did not appear again at the fence line. The duty officer ended the arrangement at the moment necessity ended, and the end held. Hans returned to the stockade's internal schedule: roll calls, work details, meal lines, latrine rotations. The same MPs who had escorted him to the wire escorted him now to routine movements, watching hands and counting heads with practiced neutrality. No extra blanket arrived, no extra ration appeared, nothing in the log marked him as anything but a prisoner. Inside the barracks, visibility carried a different price. The hard-faced prisoner controlled space by controlling attention, and he turned attention away from Hans with deliberate contempt. When Hans rose for count, the man rose later, making the delay a small signal. When Hans stepped into the meal line, the man stepped aside so others would see the gap. The message required no speech. It required only coordinated silence and the willingness of weaker men to follow it. Hans accepted the isolation without display. He had chosen responsibility and received the predictable payment inside the wire. He also watched the Americans continue to enforce boundaries that reduced what the hard-faced man could do. An MP sergeant walked the barracks aisle during movement periods, stopping long enough to make presence part of the air. Guards recorded incidents with time-stamps, and the record discouraged overt violence more effectively than threats. When a young guard, tired and sharp, shoved a prisoner who hesitated in line, the correction came in public and went into the book with a name. The sick man from Hans's barracks kept his place in the routine as well. He was not turned into a symbol, only into a case handled by procedure. When his breathing tightened again, the medical orderly returned with a thermometer and a clipboard, and the escort pair carried him to the infirmary at a pace that kept the litter level. The hard-faced prisoner watched the movement and said nothing, because the escort and the record made the moment belong to the Americans, not to him. Paperwork followed the night into daylight. The duty officer completed after-action forms that reduced the storm into categories: communication outages, dispatch delays, corrective measures, custody anomalies. He attached the pages that showed the supervised assistance and the unchanged custody procedures. He did not write a narrative of heroism. He wrote dates, times, limits, and signatures so the institution could own the decision as a disciplined act rather than a personal gamble. The log made clear that the same limits applied before the night, during the night, and after the night. A new convoy of prisoners arrived in the following days, exhausted, boots split from frozen marches, hands cracked from cold. They were searched, counted, and assigned to barracks without ceremony. The hard-faced prisoner evaluated them at once, looking for allies and followers. Hans stayed where he belonged, another man on a bunk, another number in a count. He watched the Americans apply the same search procedure, the same escort pairing, and the same logged movements to the new arrivals as they had applied to him and to the men who had tried to pressure him. Those repetitions accumulated into evidence. Hans had grown up under a state that demanded loyalty through spectacle and obedience through fear, and he had served in an army that treated people as inputs to be spent. In the stockade, he saw authority exercised as a habit of constraint, not as performance. The duty officer accepted operational risk to keep the medical chain honest, then accepted administrative risk to document how he had done it. The MPs enforced control, but they also enforced limits on themselves in front of the people they guarded, as if restraint were part of the job description rather than a favor. Hans understood that Germany could not defeat a country whose people treated rules as something they owed each other, not something imposed only on the powerless. This posture did not belong to one officer's temperament. It lived in the chain of small choices made by ordinary men. The refusal to convert urgency into cruelty, the refusal to convert power into humiliation, and the refusal to hide responsibility behind chaos. Freedom and equality, in this rear yard, operated as a discipline shared across ranks, and that shared discipline left little room for intimidation to grow into policy. Winter remained, and the front continued to consume men and fuel. Yet the stockade moved through its days with the steady mechanism of a place that expected to be judged by its records. When another storm swept across the region, the phonetic grid stayed on the wall, the logs stayed in order, and the gate control remained strict, without becoming vindictive. Ambulances came and went with fewer wrong turns and fewer idle hours, because the chain had learned to demand verified truth before movement. On a clear evening, Hans stood in the yard during a movement period and watched a convoy of trucks pass on the road beyond the fence. Their taillights slid along the horizon, steady and unbroken. Behind him, prisoners lined up for count, boots crunching on hard snow. In front of him, an MP sergeant called numbers with the same flat voice he had used in the worst night of the storm. The day ended as it began, under rules applied without ceremony. Hans returned to his barracks as a normal prisoner, and the ordinary steadiness of the place remained the final fact he carried.